Hello and welcome everyone to today's Real Training for Free. Nick Cavalanci here sitting in for Randy Franklin Smith. If you think about it, we're sort of witnessing a time in the evolution of cyber attacks that we're seeing some of the greatest innovation I think that we've seen. Some of it's, of course, very technical in nature, and some of it's just really simple, but it's under brilliant social engineering. And in either case, the end result is that the threat actors are seeing attack successes, and organizations, of course, are sort of left trying to pick up the pieces of the aftermath. And we're all here because we're trying to figure out, how do we see that change? And so today's session's about multi-factor authentication request generation attacks. That's a mouthful. You may have also heard it be called MFA prompt bombing or MFA fatigue. And in any event, you're in for kind of a real treat today, because we're going to take a look at some of this in real granular detail to give you a much better sense of how these attacks take place and then how to detect them, as well as sort of what you can do to mitigate them as well. Now, today's Real Training for Free is made possible, of course, by the good folks at LogRhythm. And I'm joined today by Sally Vincent. She's a Threat Research Senior Engineer, and Dan Kaiser. He's Threat Research Principal Engineer, both from LogRhythm. Sally, Dan, thanks for joining me, and thanks for helping make today's Real Training for Free possible.
Thanks, Nick.
Hello.
Glad you're both here. As always, just a bit of housekeeping. Today's training is being recorded. You will receive a link to it via email after the recording the next day or two or three. If you have any questions, comments, anecdotes, jokes, whatever it is you feel like telling throughout the webcast, as we always have, we try to make this very interactive. I have the Q&A box open here in front of me. Hello, Lowell. Lowell always comments, hello, Nick, at the beginning of the webcast. Nice to see you again, Lowell. Be sure to stick those into the Q&A box. We'll be happy to try and ask those contextually throughout the webcast today. And then, of course, any questions, that get missed, or maybe we've passed the contextual sort of appropriateness of the question, we'll have formal Q&A time at the very end as well. Anything else? If you're having any problems with audio or something along those lines, feel free to put those in the Q&A box and as well. And Brandon will be happy to try and see if he can assist you in any way possible. So my agenda, the first thing I'm going to cover today, just a couple of brief things before I hand the presentation over to Sally and Dan, is just kind of talk about why is there this evolution in cyber attacks to even bother attacking MFA. What's the point? It's MFA. It's far more secure than just a single authentication factor. And so why are bad guys doing it? And then just talk a little bit about some real-world examples of what's going on with MFA prompt bombing in general. And we'll have a bit of a discussion. In fact, Sally and Dan, if you guys have any commentary throughout any portion of my presentation, I might even have a question or two for you as well as I'm thinking about it. But feel free to interject. Don't worry about interrupting. Happy to include you in on this. So feel free to jump in anytime you want. And that goes for the rest of you in the audience as well. Again, the Q&A box is open. So let's start with sort of this issue of why are threat actors even trying to attack MFA? And then we'll talk about how are they doing it. And if you sat on any of my webcasts before, I love industry data. Because it does paint a picture of what's going on. And I want to use a little bit of that first. I've got a couple of stats that I'm going to put up here in a second from the Identity Defined Security Alliance's 2022 Trends in Securing Digital Identities report. Just rolls off the tongue as well. So that's the name of the report, but it's the Identity Defined Security Alliance's 2022 Trends in Securing Digital Identities report. First one here is, you see this massive number of organizations, or massive percentage, that have had identity-related breaches of some kind. Any kind of identity-related breach. Could have been just a phishing attack that's doing some kind of credential harvesting. It could have been someone doing brute force attacks. Could have been something else entirely different. But in the 84%. So identity is definitely the focus for the bad guys. Tied in with that, from the same report, you see almost 60% of orgs have had phishing campaigns that were just targeting stealing credentials. I've actually seen some other reports throughout 2022 where basically at the very top of the list, if you look at what threat actors are going after in any kind of phishing campaign, it's pretty much stealing credentials, because then they can sell those, they can leverage them in another attack, they can utilize the account that's compromised to then launch another attack against people that are related to the first person whose credentials they stole, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last one from this same report, that's a mouthful here, is about a quarter of orgs have had a brute force password attack. So that's something that's sort of sort of very interesting there, just from the standpoint of we've seen, like with ransomware, if you follow the Coveware quarterly ransomware reports as an example, Coveware is an incident response, like a ransomware response company. They help with the negotiations and that sort of thing. Every quarter they put out a report there. And so in this case, there's a lot of RDP that's still there. It's on the downturn, as a matter of fact. So phishing's still number one. It used to be like number one or number two, and they would flip-flop back and forth. But you still have this material percentage of organizations still seeing brute force password attacks. In a lot of cases, it's revolving around like RDP and that sort of thing. And then the last one actually comes from one of those Coveware reports, the one for Q3 of this year, and that's 75% of ransomware attacks, as an example, include the use of lateral movement, which of course involves authentication in some format. So now, if you look across all this data that we have here, you very much get the point that threat actors are focused on credentials. Why? Credentials, of course, are the key to being able to gain initial access, get a foothold, laterally move, gain elevated privileges, et cetera, et cetera. And so in response, organizations are therefore going to using multiple factors to authenticate a user just because it makes sense. Now, I'm actually wondering, and Sarah, you're asking, I see, by the way, you want to copy the recording. We always record this. We'll send you a link afterwards. No worries there. I'm kind of wondering, and maybe some of you can stick something into the Q&A box, but I'm wondering, one, have you already implemented MFA? So maybe it's just like a yes. And there's a second question that you can also answer in the same exact entry you put in for me, is who's being subject to MFA? Is it everyone? Is it only people that have elevated privileges? Is it a select group like the C-suite? You don't have to name like specifically everybody, but give me some sense of, are you and who's being made subject to MFA as a requirement? So I've got a bunch of answers. Thank you. Keep them coming in. I've got, like, Cal says yes, everyone. Rod says yes, everyone. Austin, yes, everyone. Charlie says MFA for M365 and service accounts. Rimsha says MFA and it applies to everybody, whole org. So I'm not actually seeing anybody say like 4 people. This makes me very happy. Amir says MFA for VPN users. Bradley says for SSO and O365, so for web-based stuff it looks like. Don says admins and service accounts, I'm assuming only. I'm going to make the presumption there. That's okay. No one's piping in saying no, so I'm assuming everybody's saying yes. I mean, Sally and Dan, does this surprise you? I mean, based on, I know that you're interacting with your customer organizations in a lot of ways where you're having a lot of visibility into what they're doing. Does this surprise you at all that you're seeing sort of, I mean, this is just overwhelming yes across the board in response to my question?
Yeah, it's pretty, I mean, most customers that I've worked with are already on MFA, and in fact, some are moving to physical keys, which I'll talk about a little bit later.
And this is actually very sort of heartwarming for me. I know that sounds weird, but for years I've been saying we have to have MFA for everyone. And people were like, no, just the important folks in the company or privileged accounts. It's like, no, everybody, because like I use the example of the mailroom clerk. And the mailroom clerk has access to, let's say, just like UPS, FedEx, and the Postal Service website on a web browser, and let's say email and through Microsoft 365. Well, that's a perfect target. If they don't have MFA, they can get compromised. The threat actor could take over that mailroom clerk's email, and then send emails out to everybody in the organization saying, like, is this your package? It came today. Can you check here? Click this link, and you install malware. And I'm painting a very simplistic, rosy picture, but that kind of thing, that scenario is then possible, and it's really important that everybody do it. So it's really good. I'm just going to double check if anybody. No one said no, but there was a few that actually said for very specific use cases and not just for everybody. But at least I don't see any no's like, nah, we're not even doing it. So that's good. So that's probably why you're here. You're wondering about the MFA prompt bombing, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Continuing on this idea of why the evolution, And the one thing that, of course, they have in common, all these different attacks that I've talked about in the previous screen, is this, that there's primarily a single authentication factor that's necessary, right? Just the password. That's why brute force still works. Although if you all are paying attention, I'm assuming you have, about just using a lot of complexity and length, primarily in the password, with some complexity, I should say. And there's a lot of really cool little graphics that exist these days that talk about, the longer it is and you throw some complexity in, you're going to materially change the ability for the password to be brute force cracked. Just not going to happen with just a small amount of effort put in place. Even Microsoft has gotten into the game of leveraging MFA. They started making the default security, unless somebody changes it, to enable a multi-factor authentication across the board starting in October of this year. And so that's something that's relatively new for most organizations. They haven't used it. It's really smart. It just by default uses, like, going out to a cell phone, you get a code, that sort of thing, something very basic like your bank does, but it's certainly better than having nothing at all. And so you enter in, now that you have organizations like all of you adopting MFA, like Microsoft and other web-based platforms adopting MFA, and the bad guys still need authentication. They still need credentials. And so you enter in this idea of MFA fatigue or prompt bombing, and I put in the title that was used in the phrase used in the title of today's webcast. That comes from MITRE. That's how MITRE refers to it, multi-factor authentication request generation. It's a mouthful, like I said. And the basic principle behind this thing is taking advantage mostly of push prompting. So the idea here is something like getting the 6-digit key really isn't the type of second factor that these threat actors are looking for. They're looking for something where the user is utilizing a second form of authentication that actually works in conjunction with the logon process. And here's what I mean. So I'll give you 2 examples. An authentication app that says, hey, push this button to show that it's really you. And once they press that button, they're actually participating in the logon process. Once they press that button, wherever the person is that's trying to actually log on is going to get in. Same thing with, like, if you receive a call and press a key. Where that differs from, for example, back to the idea of an SMS message, and here's your 6-digit code. If I get the 6-digit code and I get 1,000 of them at 1 in the morning, who am I giving that code to? Who's supposed to get it? Ultimately, obviously, the threat actor, but I have no facility to get it to the threat actor. So that's very sort of, to use the phrase sort of incorrectly, it's out of band, meaning it's not in the process. If I get it, it doesn't help at all the threat actor if I use that kind of second factor. But these, that does. It's any time that the user doesn't have to interact with the logon themselves, but participates in this second factor. That's where prompt bombing comes in. And the basic idea is, like I mentioned earlier, 1 in the morning, just keep hitting you with a button. And then at some point, the intent, of course, is that the victim user just thinks something's busted or broken. Here, fine, yes, just see if it goes away. I want to go back to bed. And this is one of the things where I talked about in my kind of, when I opened up the webcast, I talked about these very simple social engineering tactics that are used. This doesn't take any effort other than just simply, trying to log on and authenticate and request the second factor time and time again. And we've seen some recent attacks. I grabbed just a couple here. Microsoft has been constantly a focus there. We saw an attack on them, on NVIDIA, as well as Okta. And I know that Sally and Dan are going to talk about Okta today, so we'll kind of leave that out for a moment here. But that's been done by, we've seen Cozy Bear as well as Lapsus leverage this type of attacking. Sally, you mentioned a couple other companies yesterday, and I know you're going to talk about at least one of them. What were those companies again that you listed out?
So those are Cisco and Uber, which are kind of the high-profile attacks that started with MFA this year.
Yeah, and just to clarify, any differences with any of those attacks or any of the ones that I've got listed here that you can recall that's anything different than this idea of taking advantage of push prompts?
There were some slight variations, but essentially both were taking advantage of push prompts, and I've seen it at other companies as well.
Yeah, I've seen this for direct logon, like in the case of Microsoft, like Microsoft 365. We've seen VPN authentication Any other platforms you can think of that are sort of different than, let's say, an actual platform itself, like a cloud service like Microsoft 365 or maybe VPN, or any other places where you've seen prompt bombing come into play?
I can't think of one off the top of my head, but VPN is a big one.
I'd agree there. So, and this is the basic premise behind the whole thing. There's not much more to that. And so I think what I'm going to go ahead and do, I wanted to make my portion kind of short and sweet today, because I think that this sets the stage for what you guys are going to talk about here. We're not seeing, a million groups at the bottom like we've got here, just two of them that have really been doing this. But this is one of those really interesting opportunities where, because it's so few threat organizations or cyber criminal organizations, or whatever term you'd like to use, are leveraging this, we have this great opportunity. We collectively, all of you listening as well, have a chance to do something about this and actually make this thing go away very quickly. So that's why I'm really excited, and I'm loving the fact that you're on this webcast today, because the stuff you're about to see from Sally and Dan, one about detection, two about mitigation, and there's a couple things that are very obvious that you can get done to kind of put this to a complete stop. And then, should it still happen, you have an ability to detect it and do something about it. So this is one of those ones where, let's cover this, get a little bit of 101, and then figure out how to put this to rest so that it never hits your organization. So with that, I'm actually going to hand things over to Sally and Dan in a second here, and they want to show you a bit of product logs using Okta as an example here, and show you what the MFA logs look like and how they would detect unusual authentication, and then do a little bit more looking at threat hunting and some other ways of figuring out if that's going on in an environment, and then give you some ways to mitigate that. So with that, I believe, Dan, I'm giving you control. Is that correct? Making you presenter?
That's right. Thank you.
Yep. So let me go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to let you know when I can see your screen. I can see your screen. I think you're good to go. So with that, Sally, Dan, the floor is yours.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Nick. Hey, hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining our talk today. So we're going to expand upon what Nick talked about with MFA fatigue attacks, analysis and detection. And here, first of all, this is us. My name's Dan Kaiser. I'm a threat research principal engineer for LogRhythm. I've been with LogRhythm for 8 years now, and primarily I work on detection content. So we have knowledge base modules with analytics pertaining to MITRE techniques, UEBA, network detection response, and that type of thing. And so that's primarily what I work on is authoring that content, that analytic content. Sally, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So thank you for coming. My name is Sally, and I'm also a member of the threat research team. Like Dan, focused on threat detection. I also like to do a lot of reverse engineering. In my career, I've been a security consultant, an IT administrator, and Linux phone support, among other things.
Cool. So that is us. Here's our agenda. So we're going to just start by expanding a bit on Nick's discussion and talk about some other known hacks using MFA fatigue. And then we're going to move into detection and mitigation. So the first thing we're going to do is just spend a bit of time with Okta logs and get familiar with those so we understand kind of the foundational pieces or the building blocks that are required in order to come up with detections for this type of attack. And then we'll move into implementing MITRE's detection guidance. They've got 2 or 3 different ways to detect MFA fatigue in your organization. We're going to show you how to do that in LogRhythm. I mean, if you're not a LogRhythm customer, it doesn't matter that much, because these are things that you can also set up in your SIEM for detections. And then finally, we'll talk about mitigations. How do you prevent this attack, or how do you respond to this attack? So Sally, you want to give us some more examples of hacks using MFA fatigue?
Sure. So before we start into the Octalog deep dive, I just really want to drive home how important this technique is. MFA fatigue is likely to become more popular and remain popular for the foreseeable future, because really the only thing that stands between failure and success is getting a user to press a button. So it's a pretty simple attack. And passwords are cheap on the darknet. You can guess them, you can brute force them. So really every part of this hack is pretty simple to do. This year, there were 2 high-profile hacks where initial access was gained through MFA fatigue. In September, a hacker associated with the Lapsus group, who interestingly enough also happens to be a teenager, allegedly infiltrated Uber's VPN, where they then sent push notifications as if they were the employee, thus granting themselves access to Uber's systems. Like Slack, which you see the blurry screen cap of a screen cap here, where they announced themselves after they had gained some persistence. They were able to gain entry there to a shared drive that contained PowerShell scripts from which they pilfered admin credentials to Uber's privileged access management PAM service. So really there are actually several lessons in this story. I do want to mention that having a zero trust environment will really reduce the damage a hacker could do if they got into your network through MFA. And earlier this May, a hacker was able to breach Cisco, and they were able to add a new MFA device once he got the initial acceptance. He was also able to move laterally, gain administrative access, and install tools like TeamViewer, Mimikatz, and Cobalt Strike. And this all seems like pre-ransomware type activity, but luckily they caught him once he started doing that before things could get worse. Back to you, Dan.
Thanks a lot, Sally. So yeah, again, it's the real deal. It's important stuff. So let's move on and talk about Octalog familiarization. And again, LogRhythm accepts or is able to collect logs from many different multi-factor providers, but we're going to focus in on Okta here as an example. So I'm going to do a deep dive of Okta authentication logs just to give you some familiarity, and as I mentioned before, kind of give you the building blocks for detection of multi-factor fatigue attacks. So I'm going to walk through the logs that you'll see in 4 different scenarios. First of all, successful AD authentication and push verify. Successful AD authentication and push deny. So this is what you're going to see like repeatedly in an MFA fatigue attack. It's just continual pushes and denies and denies and denies and that denies, and unfortunately an allow might follow that at some point. Also for interest, we're going to take a look at what does it look like when a user just decides to type in a code rather than send a push? How does that look in the logs? And then just unsuccessful AD authentication. So for example, maybe the user doesn't have credentials and so they're brute force attacking an account. What does that look like in the logs? A bit of a disclaimer here. The Okta product that you have affects the logs that are generated. So the logs I'm going to be showing you here are from an Okta Classic Engine deployment. The Okta Identity Engine logs are slightly different. Not a ton, but a bit. So just be aware of that. So this demo, I'm going to go ahead and walk through those 4 scenarios. It's about 8 minutes long, so bear with me. It's not, the most exciting stuff in the world, but it'll give you a good foundation, I believe, for the rest of our discussion here. So let me go ahead and start up this demo. And kind of the subplot here is also, as far as LogRhythm is concerned, how to take advantage of the analyzer grid. So a lot of times when you see LogRhythm demos, you see like the dashboards of a bunch of widgets and stuff. And that's great, but there's also something called the analyzer grid where you're able to customize all the metadata that you're looking at for the logs that you're trying to review. So here's the grid, and we're starting off in a section called favorites, and favorites allows you to set up the log view with all the metadata you want to see in whatever order. So there's particular columns I want to see, particular metadata, and I'm just going to show you that it's really easy to customize this. So I'm going to add 2 different pieces of metadata here. One is the session ID and one is the user agent string. So I'm just going to favorite those and go back to my favorites view. And now I've got all of the metadata that I'm interested in my analysis. And I can just start from the bottom and work my way up and take a look at the scenarios. So the first one is an auth success and a push verify. So starting at the bottom here, the first thing that you'll see in the logs is the vendor message ID, user authentication auth via AD agent. Something interesting here is that the user origin is system, it's not the person. And the user impacted is the person who's doing the authentication. So if you're doing threat hunting, be cognizant of that. Make sure that you're searching both fields, origin and impacted. The IP address, this is the IP of the device that the person is authenticating from. Okay, and here we see the result is success. They had typed in successful credentials. The type of device, so here it's a computer as opposed to a mobile device. And then finally, well, not finally, but here we have the location derived from the IP address. So this is somewhere in India. Session IDs. Now this is interesting because, if you do threat hunting or detection engineering, sometimes you get excited when you see a session ID because it allows you, in a lot of cases, to correlate logs definitively, things that might be hard to correlate in other ways. But I want to note here that with these Okta classic logs, the session ID doesn't follow all the way through the sequence of the login here. So you can't necessarily just pivot on that and get everything you need when you're doing your investigation. Finally, the user agent string. So this is going to be, again, of the device that the user authenticated with, and sometimes that can give you some good information about the device itself. We'll talk more about user agents strings in just a bit. So the person has successfully entered credentials. The next thing is a user session start. We say the word session quite a bit in this discussion, but this is basically just like an Okta session. And then we move on to something called policy evaluate sign-on. So here we're determining whether all the requirements have been met for the user to launch the app. And you can see that the result here on the right side is challenge. So there's something left to be done. We can see the reason for the challenge in the raw log. If we bring up the details and actions pane here and look through the raw log, part of it which hasn't been parsed out is this section on the bottom says require MFA at logon. Next, the user decides to send a push rather than type in a code, so you have a send factor verify push. And then you have an auth via MFA. So this is an important log because this is the log about the push being verified, and it shows information about the device that they used. So that's the IP address of the device that they used to verify the push. And then we see that it was successful. We see that it was from a mobile device as opposed to a computer. And again, we see location information and user agent string. So now all the requirements for the login have been met. So we're in user authentication verify success, and then user authentication SSO. So you'll be seeing one of these for each like app or Okta tile, if you're familiar with Okta, that the person launches. And if you're curious, you can actually see which app they used or launched rather. Once again, in the raw log, you can see in this case that they launched Rally software. So moving on, what does a push deny look like? So this gets straight to the scenario we're discussing today as far as MFA fatigue. In this case, the person is going to initially do a deny push and then a verify right after that. So it's probably just user error. But we start again with the authentication logs. They log in using their AD credentials. Again, the user origin is system. The user impacted is the person. And you've got, the IP address of the device and so on and so forth. So that's all the same. Because this was successful, we also get a successful user session start. So a result of success in that case. And then we can move on to the policy evaluate sign-on. Once again, the challenge here is because we need MFA. The person decides to send a push as opposed to typing in a code. But here we see a deny push, so this is new. This is the type of log you'll see in the MFA fatigue scenario where this is continual deny, deny, deny as long as the person is hitting, deny, of course, when they get it on their mobile phone. But in this case, another push is sent immediately after that. Again, that's because the attacker might be even being through automation be sending the good credentials over and over again. Okay, so let's switch gears, and this is more for information. I mean, what if the user decides to type in a code rather than get a push verify? What metadata, what information do we get about that process? And it starts off pretty much the same way as the first two. The person, again, has to type in their credentials, so you see the user authentication auth via AD agent, complete with the metadata that we're pretty used to by now, and continues on to user session start, and that's successful. Policy evaluate sign-on, again with a challenge because they need MFA. But this this is where it changes. So here we just see nothing about a push. We just see user authentication auth via MFA. And the interesting thing here is the device that's logged is, the same machine that the person authenticated with. So they're just typing their code in that they got from their phone or whatever into the laptop or the computer that they're using. So there's really no information here about, the device that they read the code off of. So that's just, again, just kind of an FYI there. So once they've done that, they complete the verify process, and in this case, you see multiple applications being launched. It's things like, Office 365, Salesforce, what other, any other Okta kind of protected applications that the user wants to launch. Okay, one final scenario here. Thanks for bearing with me on this, and that's, auth. What if the auth is failed? What if the user doesn't have, or the attacker doesn't have good credentials? What if they're kind of brute forcing the account? Well, this is, as you can see, kind of short and sweet. I mean, you might see this sequence over and over and over and over again, but basically you just get two logs. One is the user authentication auth via AD agent, but this time the result is failure. Okay, so there were bad credentials, and you'll see that in the raw log as well. And as a result of that, the Okta session start is also failed, and you can see that right here. So that's it. Just short and sweet, two logs on that one. So hopefully that helped. I know, thanks for bearing with me on that. I know it's a bit dry, but again, it kind of sets the foundation for this next section here. I guess I'll pause for just a second. Are there any questions queued up, Nick?
Yeah, there was a couple that did come in throughout, but they can wait till now. Jonathan asked about are Azure AD logs similar to the ones the Okta logs that you're showing here today?
Yeah, I haven't spent a bunch of time digging into those, and maybe we can put out a blog regarding that in the near future. But I mean, I think the same kind of components have to happen as far as like the initial AD authentication, and then an evaluation of what whether MFA is required and in what form and so on. So I think it's going to be a similar flow. I just don't know the specific bits of metadata that are provided in those logs.
Well, fair enough. And then another question came in about the logs that you are showing, the Okta logs we're going to look at today. How far apart in the logs are these log entries? Are these things that are happening one right after the other, or is this something that's spread out over time?
No, they're all within. They're all very quick. Let me see if I can. Sorry, one sec here. Let me see if I can get into the demo again and just show the times. Oh, you know what? I don't think I have the timestamps in the demo, but they are very quick. I mean, they're all within the same minute and sometimes within the same second, actually. So yeah, they are very quick right after each other. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to detection here. So now that we have the building blocks in place, we're going to talk about taking MITRE's detection guidance around MFA fatigue attacks and turning that into analytics in the SIEM. I've been talking a bit, so Sally, why don't you give us this first detection technique, repeated push denies?
Sure. So one of MITRE's recommended detections is looking for an unusually large number of push denies that indicate a user's credentials have been stolen. Usually you aren't going to get more than one or two, if any, push denies from users that I've seen. And hackers are often going to run scripts that generate way more pushes than a person could manually. Something to note too is that these detections that we're talking about are Okta recommended. So in September, in an article on MFA fatigue, Okta recommended to Bleeping Computer that all SOCs using it should set thresholds and triggering alarms to your SOC if events exceed specific thresholds, regardless of technology. So this is all an Okta recommended mitigation here.
Great. Okay. So I mean, one question you might ask, and this is usually true when if you're trying to come up with an analytic where it says, well, look for something that's unusual or abnormal, the first thing you have to do is figure out what's normal, right? So one thing you might want to do is do an investigation in your own organization and just see how frequently do push denies happen. And this is easily done, in LogRhythm. Of course, you just do an investigation with the log source type being API Okta event, and the vendor message ID being user MFA Okta verify deny push. And if you want to visualize visualize it easy, just put it out in a trend chart. And you can see in this case, in this organization, on average, there's less than 1 deny per hour. So it's pretty modest number of denies. Here you're seeing a screenshot of what's called an AI engine rule in LogRhythm. AI engine stands for Advanced Intelligence Engine. It's not AI, it's not artificial intelligence. So this is more of a correlation engine than like a machine learning type of thing. But you're looking at the construction of an analytic rule for this detection. And I'll show you, kind of blow up the sections of the rule that are most important. And Sally, you want to walk us through the logic here?
Got to get off mute there.
Okay.
So this is a pretty simple AI engine rule here. We call this rule block a threshold rule block, and it just looks for a certain number of logs within a specific time frame. So here, within a 10-minute time frame, we're looking for 5 or more push denies from one user. And we're specifying the log source is Okta API event. Our group by here, just how we organize this is by user. So pretty simple there.
Okay, great. So 5 or more logs per, and this was per 10 minutes, right?
Yep, per 10 minutes. And something else to kind of note is that this 5, you may have to tune it up or even down based on your organization. And just a pro tip within LogRhythm, if you ever see like a system rule within LogRhythm, just one of our canned AI rules, and you want to change the threshold, I recommend cloning that rule because depending on your KB sync settings, that threshold can actually be reset when the KB syncs. So just a little pro tip there.
Okay, great. Okay, kind of a variation on that analytic, not necessarily cited by MITRE, but I mean, if you think about it, what's worse than a bunch of rapid push denies? A rapid push deny followed by a push allow, right? So this is where the person has finally like relented and said, okay, fine. So here what you're seeing is a correlation rule, and that kind of blue section in the middle of those 2 blocks, we sometimes call that like the rule canvas. And each block represents a series of criteria that needs, or a set of criteria that needs to be met, and they're correlated, and that's represented by the line in between those two blocks. So I'm going to again kind of blow up the different parts of it. And Sally, if you wouldn't mind, you want to kind of talk about this rule and how it's built?
Sure. So really super simple again. Rule block 1 is exactly what we just talked about, that threshold. And then rule block 2 is just looking for an allow from that very same user that had the repeated push denies. So pretty simple there. Something I do want to note is that this rule, once you get that threshold tuned, is a really good candidate for alarming. You don't have to necessarily alarm on an AI rule. You can just, while you're tuning it, set it to event and just kind of get that worked out before you send an alarm to your SOC. But this guy's a good candidate for alarming as well as doing some SOAR orchestration, which I'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, if you set the rule to just event and not alarm, you can put that information up on a dashboard and just kind of monitor it rather than being hit with a ton of alarms. Next detection theory is rapid logon attempts. Per MITRE, monitor two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication logs for suspicious events such as rapid login attempts with valid credentials. So let's take a look at that detection. First again, the same question, what is rapid in your environment? What's normal, what's abnormal? And it's very easy to determine that just by doing, once again, an investigation. In this case, log source type Okta event, vendor message ID, user authentication auth via AD agent, result of success, and then just put that out if you want on a trend chart and look at it, or you could, pull it into Excel if you want, export the logs out to Excel and do whatever further analysis you want to do. here is the rule. Sally, let me hand it over to you to talk about.
Sure. Again, super simple and really the same as the previous threshold, looking for push denies, but we're just looking for authentication attempts using the vendor message ID that Dan talked about earlier, user authentication, auth via AD agent. Luckily, octalogs are just pretty uniform, nice and easy to parse and work with.
Right, and you might have seen, demonstrations of this type of attack on YouTube or something like that, where, it's happening via a script. So it's that log count of 5 or more in 10 minutes is quite modest because they could be hitting up the person, hundreds of times a minute with automation. Okay, and then finally, location-based detections. Sally, you want to talk about this detection theory?
Sure. So this is a little bit of a trickier one to do, but MITRE is basically looking for a mismatch in the location of the logon attempt and the location of the push response.
Great. Okay. Yeah. So let's dive into that a little bit. Not quite as straightforward. So what are some challenges in the location mismatch detection? So again, the idea is you're the person who is authenticating and the person who is verifying the push, they're just in one. They should just be in one physical location, right? Can you detect that they're not? That those two things are happening in different places. It's not quite as straightforward as you might think. So first of all, location is usually determined in logs via the public IP address. And depending on the network scenario you're talking about, public IPs can change quickly and dramatically. So think about, for example, let's say that I work for a company that's based out of London. That's where the headquarters is. And I'm working here in Denver, Colorado. Some of the log activity that I'm generating might result in my public IP being, from my home ISP connection or whatnot. But, once I have to VPN into London in order to do some other internal only work, it's, according to logs, I've just magically been transported over to London. Even in more simple scenarios, if I'm, just sitting at home and I've got, a laptop and I've got my mobile device, if for some reason both of those devices are on different networks, like maybe the laptop's on Wi-Fi and the mobile's on the cellular network, that can end up showing up as being in different cities, for example. So that's challenging enough. And then also think about attackers. I mean, if you've got a sophisticated, motivated attacker and they really are trying to compromise a user, they can use proxies to appear that they're in the same location as the user that they're trying to compromise. Sally, do you have any further comment on this discussion?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, something that I've seen a lot recently too that complicates this is a lot more users are using VPNs now with work from home. So I've seen like a lot of weird origin locations because users are using NordVPN or whatever VPN service they saw on a podcast.
Great. Okay, but I wanted to just dwell on this for just a moment more and just talk about, of course there's challenges, but as always, you always want to try to make this analytic as relevant to your environment as possible. So how do you assess this detection theory in your own environment using LogRhythm? So I'm just going to do a quick demo here of showing you how to set up a dashboard where you can compare the push sends and the push verifies or denies and see how easy it is to do. So basically my goal is I'm going to set up a widget showing push sends and I'm going to show a widget showing push denies or verifies and compare those locations. So I'm going to create a new web console dashboard here. So I'm just going to click on the dashboard button in the upper right and make a new dashboard. And I'm going to call it Okta Location Analysis. And I want to filter this dashboard so it's only showing Okta logs. So I'm just going to make that Lucene filter there. And then I'm going to pull out a few widgets and customize them. So I'm going to grab this TopX widget here, and I'm going to pull it across the width of the page because I want to see a timeline or a trend here. And first I'm going to customize the name of the widget so that it's Octopush location. I'm going to set the metadata field to location origin. And then this is the kicker here. I'm going to filter the widget so it only shows push sends. So using the vendor message ID that we've talked about already quite a bit, and make it a trend chart. So that's the first widget. The second widget is going to be very much the same, but it's going to be push verifies or denies. So I'm going to go into the widget settings. I'm going to go to customize the name, set the field to location origin. I'm going to set the widget filter to only show verifies and denies. Again, based on the log analysis we did earlier, and make it a trend chart. One final widget here is going to be the user origin, because we're going to want to filter this dashboard by the user. So I'm going to pull out one final TopX widget. This one doesn't necessarily have to be a trend. I mean, it could just be a bar chart, but just to keep it consistent. So we'll set this to user origin. There's really no reason to filter the widget because we're already filtering for Okta logs. And you can see here that there are a few user accounts that we don't care about necessarily, so they're the service accounts. So I can just exclude them from the dashboard pretty readily just with an Alt double click Windows or an Option double click on a Mac. And you can see in the upper left here that it's filtering out those two user origin accounts. All right, so now we can go ahead and do our analysis. So let's take a look at just any user here. And so on the top, we're seeing the location of push sends, and the bottom is push verifies. In this case, they're both from Colorado, so that's pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at somebody else. This one's a little more interesting. So if we zoom in a little bit here, we can see that the push sends are from 3 different locations, from Colorado and from 2 different regions in India. And all of the verifies are in India. Why is that true? I mean, it might be what we talked about before, where the person's using a VPN for some of their connections. One more person here, so let's take a look at Matthias Gross. So what's interesting about this one is the push sends are from Romania and India, and you might not be aware of any corporate presence in Romania. Like there's no offices, no customers, no employees in Romania. So that's kind of strange, and we'll talk more about that type of detection in a bit. And then finally, I just want to take a second and talk about user agent strings. So now that I've set up this dashboard, I can use a similar configuration to review user agent strings. Maybe there's a user that I think may have been compromised, or maybe I'm doing forensic analysis of a compromised user. I can start considering like the devices that were in play or the scripting that was in play in order for this to happen. So now I'm looking again at push sends and push verifies or denies, but this time it's the device user agent string. I mean, we know that these can be manipulated pretty easily, but you can also just look for things like rapid changes, any indications that maybe automation was involved, like maybe you're seeing, I don't know, like a user agent string from a Python module. And at the bottom here, Sally had talked about like the Cisco attack where someone had registered a new device. You might see that sudden change there from one device to another that's doing the push sends or push denies. So again, just another demonstration of how to visualize and do your analysis through these trend widgets. All right, there you go. So hopefully that was helpful. So all that being said, I think we drove the point home that it's a difficult type of detection to do, but there is at least one straightforward detection you can do with a location. Sally, you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. So this rule is based off one of what I think are like the classic LogRhythm AI detections that I have seen give, some true positive hits time and time again. and that is looking for an authentication, or in this case, sending a push from a region that is not allowed. So the list here, whitelisted regions, is a list within LogRhythm that you fill in. And so these are countries or locations where you have a corporate footprint or you expect to see authentications from. And this is a way easier thing to do, to have this allow list than a block list, because the block list is going to be much, much larger than the allow. So here we're just saying if we see a push sent from something that does not match our allow list, then we're going to throw up an alarm.
Great. And if you're wondering, the list there, CCF whitelisted regions, that's being we're borrowing that from one of our compliance framework modules, the Common Compliance Framework. So I mean, if you're already using a list for other analytics, by all means, just pop it in here as well. And then mitigations. I think Sally, this is you.
Awesome. So now I'm going to take it home by talking about some mitigations besides detection, which is a recommended mitigation. One mitigation that I don't have a slide for, but I want to briefly touch on, is using a physical key, which is a small device like a USB that connects to your computer or other device and provides encrypted authentication. So moving to physical or hard keys is going to be more expensive and requires user training. However, it does stop this type of MFA attack we're talking about and several others. Companies like Google, Twitter, and Cloudflare have all switched to hard keys for this reason. That being said, there are some fairly easy steps to take to reduce the chances that an MFA fatigue attack will be successful against your environment. The first of which is user training, which doesn't cost that much, and it doesn't really take that much time to show users what this attack is and to just tell them not to accept it. Encouraging users to report a successful attack without being blamed is really important. You want users to feel comfortable coming to your security, your SOC team when something goes wrong. And honestly, when hundreds of push notifications keep popping up on your phone at odd hours, it's really easy to accidentally accept one. Next slide. So Okta's Director of Security describes threat insight as the first line of defense against MFA fatigue attacks. This is an Okta-specific mitigation here. So Threat Insight aggregates data about sign-on activity across the Okta customer base to analyze and detect potentially malicious IP addresses. You can choose to log and or block Threat Insight ID'd IPs. I personally recommend doing both. I've seen Okta with and without blocking Threat Insight IPs, and having it set to block just cuts down on the number of attempted attacks a SOC sees and might be alarming on. So it really just saves you some time in dealing with alarms. You can find threat insight logs like the one I have here on the left by searching for the vendor message ID security threat detected with periods in between the words. These logs show the IP, the user agent, and sometimes the attack type. Besides just being interesting, these logs can be used in a block list, in other products, or used in threat hunts. You could also track the number of attempted attacks against you to look for trends. You could look at user agents as well. I've seen some really oddball Chinese phones in these logs that I've never seen used in the US. Okta also has a feature called risk-based authentication that you can enable that requires credentials like biometrics or push notification with number challenge for auths that it identifies as unusual. So risk-based auth uses Okta's adaptive MFA and threat insight to analyze the user's context. This may be right for your environment, just remember that it's an additional burden on users and might require some training. So let's go look at some specific Okta user actions. And again, these are Okta specific, but for other MFA platforms like 365, they're going to have really similar actions that you can take for users. So if you do find out that an MFA fatigue attack has occurred through detections or through user self-reporting, it isn't too late to stop major damage. Disabling the user's account is going to be the first step. For Okta, I also recommend killing all active sessions. Disabling the user in Okta does do that, but there are some corner cases that I've tested where somebody will still have access to applications through the session after disabling the users. So you should do both, in my opinion. These actions can be done through the Okta user options like you see on the right in the Okta console, or through an API, which I'll talk about on the next slide here. So using SOAR allows for third-party integrations between security products and allows for automation of SOC tasks just to make your life easier. LogRhythm SOAR implementation is based on a feature that we call Smart Response. We have Smart Response for Okta as well as a lot of other third-party products. The Okta integration has actions that include disabling a user and killing all their sessions, as well as like resetting a password, getting information on that user. A smart response can be run on demand from the web console. This is what I have a picture here of on the right. So if you open up the inspector window for logs, you get the smart responses available for the field you select. For example, if you see a sketchy user like me authenticated, then you can immediately disable my Okta account and kill my sessions. Smart responses can also be tied to alarms. The rapid push denies followed by push allow is a really good candidate to attach the Okta disable user and clear user session smart responses. You can run multiple smart responses from one alarm. And if you don't have LogRhythm, you can probably script Okta integration into your product of choice. I found that the Okta API is pretty straightforward, and scripting for it is not bad at all. So, all right, that's what we have for you today. Here are some resources that you can use to learn a little bit more about what we just talked about. And yeah, please let us know if you have any questions in the chat.
There's quite a number of questions that have come in here, which is perfect. We've got plenty of time still left to do that today. Some of them I think you've probably sort of addressed. Like there's a question from Amir. He asked early on, actually about a half an hour ago, but you've shown since then a little bit of this. But I thought I'd at least ask. Amir asked, how do you create meaningful notifications based on MFA attacks? And I guess the question here is, it's probably just the number of MFA prompts that are being logged, as well as the frequency within a certain time frame. Would that be kind of accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And like Dan went over a little bit, it will kind of vary from environment to environment. Not that much, but it may be different. So you'll have to kind of go back and see like how many push denies, how many authentications you get, and just kind of tune that.
Yeah, there's Michael's asking about, this is an Okta question, but maybe you still might have the answer. Michael wants to know, do you have a link to the Okta recommendations with the specific thresholds to monitor for?
You know, I've not seen a specific threshold that they've said. We do have a link in our resources to places where they talk about detections and recommendations, and they don't say a specific number. It's more environment-based, but those are in our resources.
Yeah, Chad made an interesting comment talking about location accuracy being an issue, especially with cellular data, and mentions a scenario where AT&T had identified him as being in New Jersey despite the commute this morning. Well, he was really in Boston, Massachusetts, and it was a legitimate MFA push event. Do you find much of that going on as well?
All the time. Location is so tricky.
Yeah, that does become kind of an interesting issue here. So Bradley made a comment. In our experience, Threat Insight incorrectly identifies legitimate users as malicious, so we had to disable it. Any kind of commentary on that?
That's interesting. I've not seen it, but I've had pretty good luck with it myself at least. But you could always try and logging and just look in the logging and just kind of fill that into a list potentially as well. So trying to work with some of the threat insight logs, and you can honestly like take some of those IPs, pull them out automatically, and maybe put them in a monitoring list instead of just blocking.
Yeah, there's an interesting question John's asking. This may be actually more of an MFA question than something that you guys would answer, but John's asking, what if the user just ignores the notifications rather than pressing deny in the first place?
Dan, do you want to go on that one?
Sure. I mean, well, I mean, I think what Sally was saying before about reporting it is the best thing for the user. I mean, obviously the user has done a good thing by ignoring the pushes, but reporting it to IT or whatever would be, or the security team would be the best next step. But I mean, you do know though that you do have a compromised set of credentials. That's how they were able to pull off the attempt of the attack. So at the very least, I would think that a change of password would be in order. And other, whatever else you have in your playbook as far as like, if it's coming from a single IP address, do you block that those types of things? But I mean, that's not an awful outcome.
Yeah, there was another question. You guys had mentioned physical keys a little bit during your presentation and mentioned the YubiKey. And I know the answer, but I'm going to let you guys talk about this. John's asking, is YubiKey an example of a physical key?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it's good to read up on what's called like phishing resistance MFA, and YubiKey's got great articles on that, and who's the guy from Know Before, John Grimes or whatever, they talk quite a bit about phishing resistant MFA.
It's Roger Grimes, but that's
I'm sorry, Roger Grimes.
You can call him John. I won't tell him.
Sorry. But yeah, that's that frequently involves something like a YubiKey or a hardware key. Yeah.
Let me see here. Oh boy, I'm going to murder your name, and I don't want to. Grigorij, I think, and if I murdered it, I apologize. Asks, do you have similar guides for Microsoft Authenticator? Or similar, maybe some similar guidance for Microsoft Authenticator?
We haven't really dug into the Microsoft logging as much as we have in the Okta, for example. I mean, probably the first place I would look is to look at like the Windows Defender threat hunting definitions for that type of thing. I mean, Microsoft's got some great documentation on MFA fatigue attacks. But we can definitely try to put out something in the future that's more specific to the Microsoft ecosystem.
Perfect there. The question about LogRhythm, Mohammed's asking, can we make custom smart responses in LogRhythm?
Yes, you can. If you can script it, you can do it.
Okay, that's easy enough there. Let me see what else. I've got some stuff in here. So Amir made a comment. This is back at around 12:30. So this is a little bit back when you were doing I think, Dan, you were playing the video. And Amir's comment was, and this might be more of maybe clear up some of the perception and or maybe Amir's spot on. I'm not sure which. But Amir said the logs that you showed are for investigation, but how do you detect when it's happening? Do you feel like the logs you were showing were actually used for, I mean, and your intent, of course, is to do this as close to real time as is possible. Can you just talk a little bit about that, about investigation versus detection when it's happening in real time?
So this is pretty simple. Like you can go look at your logs and do a threat hunt, do searches and dashboarding like Dan said, and detecting it when it happens would be putting on those AI rules that we showed. So those are hands off. You configure those, you set them to go, and then they alarm when they see the set of logs come in.
Okay. Let's see. Brandon had a long one here. Let me see if I can. There's a couple of questions here. So Brandon says, our recent MFA bombing issues start out as multiple prompts from the threat actor sent to the user's Microsoft Authenticator app. But then after being denied, the threat actor selects the option to have the user called, which the user answers and accepts. I've not gone too far into this, but is that a common / successful tactic? And should that option to receive MFA via calls be disabled? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is a common tactic, and actually that was part of some of the attacks that I talked about here. So it is something that you might want to disable, in my opinion. It's very common and it's often very successful.
Yeah, it just makes sense that one of the premises of this whole thing we talked about early on, Sally, just very briefly at the beginning when I was doing my portion of the presentation, was just this whole intent is to try and find a socially engineered way to just get the user to give up. That whole idea of fatigue is a great word in this case because it's like, please stop calling me. Just tired, fatigue. I'm tired of you calling me. And disabling anything where there's that, I use the term out of band in this case. It's sort of in band using my own phrasing, but in that the user is now participating in the logon and getting them through fatigue to participate in the logon. Any methodology there should be disabled. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And as well as just accepting to stop the calls or to stop the notifications. It could happen accidentally if you're maybe driving and this comes in, or if you're cooking dinner for your family. It's really easy to accidentally accept one of these things.
Could you imagine? Just having dinner, Thanksgiving, accept it. Somebody logs in, that'd be bad. Seth mentions here, or asks a question, so would a possible resolution be to have the user interact with MFA by physically entering the code? Which obviously sounds logical. Then the user has to do that, and the user's not going to do that. That sounds a lot more like someone's actually trying to log on. But what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that would be a mitigation. And Okta does have that through like the risk-based authentication. You can do like a number challenge.
Another question came in. There was an earlier comment, I think, about Azure. And Chris has got a question. Any links that you might have that you could share that are relevant to how to set up LogRhythm to monitor and report on Azure AD MFA activity and events?
I would just start with the, we don't have a guide specific to MFA logs, but as far as just like getting the integration set up, if you go to the docs.logrhythm.com, we've got the device configuration guides for collecting the Azure logs. But I don't know that we've got a specific guide about MFA yet.
So another question came in here. And this is actually more some questions about the MFA vendors, like Duo, Microsoft, and there's a couple other ones that have been mentioned throughout some of these questions here today. And I'm seeing a couple of these questions here, like Sean had said, what are some of the common vendors going to do to move and challenge? Are they going to move to something like a challenge code like Google Authenticator? There was another one that where someone who goes by the letter T, so I guess it's Mr. T, he's here today. He pities the fool. Duo now has authenticated pushes where you have to accept the push and enter a one-time passcode into the Duo app that's shown on the login screen to prevent these types of attacks. In general, maybe I'll kind of summarize some of this up and ask a different question. Are you seeing, and we have the example here of what Duo is already doing, but are you seeing MFA vendors responding to this? One of the things I talked about at the beginning of this whole thing was we have this interesting opportunity now that it's happening with just a few threat actor groups. And we as an entire IT community can actually do something about it through the vendors, through better policy, through better training, through the folks who are listening today, learning about what's going on so they can figure out how to make their environments more secure. We can kind of almost wipe this out very, very quickly. Are you seeing the vendors doing their part, Sally and Dan, to try and either disable methodologies or provide a workaround, something, a different way of doing authentication to avoid this from happening?
You're seeing vendors such as Microsoft, Apple, and so on, moving more towards adopting the FIDO or FIDO2 specifications. I guess the thing that comes to mind to me is like the executive order from the Biden administration last year regarding cybersecurity, and I think there was a clarifying memo earlier this year where they specifically talk about MFA by itself is not sufficient. It has to be phishing resistant MFA. So things like push verifies and stuff like that are just off the table. So to the extent that all these major vendors are going to be working with the federal government in some way, that's hopefully just going to kind of trickle into the consumer space. So, I mean, to me, the question is, what's the lag? I mean, how many years, how are we still going to have to deal with? I mean, I'm still getting, SMS two-factor auth from most of the, sites that I log into. And what the federal government said 20 years ago that SMS isn't sufficient or isn't safe. So I guess the question is, what's the lag and what do you do in the meantime?
It wasn't the general rule of thumb for any technology like 20 years to be completely integrated in society, and I guess IT is the same example. And we're still doing using the same technology 20 years later, just using it a little better. Joshua mentioned just real quickly that they're using hard RSA tokens on anything external, and you can only use push approvals once you're already inside the network. So they've got a different set of authentication policies based on whether you're inside or outside the network. That's sort of interesting. Mohammed has another question about the smart responses. Can we edit existing smart response plugins within LogRhythm?
Yes, you can. It's kind of tricky. So another pro tip is you can change, if you download a smart response from us, I think it's .srp or something, you can change that to .tgz and then extract it twice, and then you can get to the the scripts behind it, and then you can edit those scripts and then just repackage the smart response in the smart response plugin manager. So yes, you can.
Perfect answer. Let me get rid of this one, get rid of this one. Let me see here if there's any other questions that I haven't answered. Oh, John asked early on, right when you guys started your presentation, do you have to have a dog to work at LogRhythm? I think it's a response to Sally, your pictures with your dog. So I'm assuming the answer is no.
I think it might be, although we actually do have a team member that doesn't have a dog, so he's kind of left out in these pictures we do here at our presentations.
Very good, yes.
He's got a cat, but I think he's paid less, actually.
Is that how it works at LogRhythm? Well, there you go, folks. If you want to move up in life and make some more money, join LogRhythm and have a dog when you interview. I think that covers kind of anything. Cal said, "Ooh, ouch." I guess Cal's a cat lover. He's going to make less money at LogRhythm than his dog-owning counterpart. Anyways, I think we're done for the Q&A. If there's any other questions, I'll just make sure I keep my eye on this as I'm closing us out. But just want to thank the folks at LogRhythm for sponsoring today's real training for free. Sally, Dan, this was really good. Lots of detail. Obviously, a lot of really good questions coming in. People enjoyed this, I think, just based on the feedback and the comments and the questions that we got. So thank you both.
Yeah, thanks to everyone who attended and the great participation. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks, everyone, for all the questions.
Wonderful. So again, thanks to LogRhythm for making today's real training for free possible. This is going to conclude today's webcast, everyone. We're going to give you about 15 minutes of your day back. So enjoy that. Thanks for attending, and we'll catch you on the next one.